I am Dr. Sandra K. Smith. I am excited about participating in what I know has been a legacy for decades now. And I have had just a small portion to do with that success, but I know that Brother Smalls and company, that his spirit of perseverance and his attitude as a servant leader has allowed you all to be successful for so long. And I know there are many, many good people that are behind the curtain working diligently to bring success to our young people. So without further ado, I do bring you greetings from Christian Fellowship Church, where my husband, Pastor John G. Smith, is the senior pastor. Now I'm going to get to the business at hand, and I promise not to be 30 minutes long. I'm going to try to keep it short. As a matter of fact, right now I'm going to set my timer for 12 minutes. I would like to speak to you today from 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 12, and the 8th section of that verse. It reads, "And they said to him, We have come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." I would like to speak to you today from the topic, Don't Tie Up Your Own Deliverance. The children of Israel were caught in a cycle. If you look throughout the Old Testament, you can see that they were caught in a cycle of 4 S's: sin, servitude, supplication, and salvation. They would do something wrong. They would disobey God. They would worship idol gods. They would do things that they knew not to do according to the teaching of Moses and the law. Then they would end up being spanked by the enemy, and the Lord would draw back his hand of protection from them and allow them to go into some kind of servitude, some kind of capture, where they would be under the duress of whatever their enemies decided to do to them. This could include raping their women, having them do things opposite of what they had been spiritually taught, and working very hard in those types of things, taking away their identity as the children of God. And then in that servitude and trouble and distress, they would cry out to God, and that would be the supplication. And as they would cry to God, then God would bring them salvation. And that salvation would come through usually judges, men of God, that God would bring to their aid. Samuel, in this case, was the deliverer, the person that God sent to bring salvation. And in those times, a judge would also be sort of like a captain of the army. He would lead them in the judgment against the enemy. And so Samson was no different. Just a little backdrop. A lot of times we see Samson as this muscular figure, but you have to ask yourself, if Samson had muscles, why would people continue to try to figure out where his strength came from? Now, a lot of people criticize Samson because he liked to play around with the grace that God had given him, and he would like to give riddles and trick people into trying to figure out where his strength came from. And of course, most people know that he was tricked by Delilah into giving the actual secret. And so many people feel like, oh, his strength was in his hair. Actually, Samson's hair represented the presence of God. And when his hair had grown out, it was symbolic of God being with him. Of course, when he gave away the secret, they cut his hair, and he woke up unable to do. He thought, like many of us do, that he would go out and do it as he had always done. And often when we have displeased God, we think that we will go out and do as we have always done, and we find ourselves unequipped. But I think often that we're a little bit too hard on Samson. Samson is in Hebrews in the hall of faith. So he would not have been there had God not seen him in an honorable light. And God had chose him to come to the aid and deliverance as the deliverer of Israel at that time after they had cried out. And so we also need to understand that Samson represented Israel. Samson's fickleness was mirrored the fickleness of Israel, in that they were up and down, again, caught in that cycle of four S's, as we often see church people who uh, dub themselves as Christians or children of God as well. Again, they were caught in sin, servitude, supplication, and then salvation. So they cried out to God. God sent Samson. Now, Samson came, like many of our answers to prayers, with some other situations surrounding it. And so the children of Israel decided that they didn't want to deal with all the issues that came with their deliverance through Samson. Samson got angry and he burned the fields. He tied foxes' tails together, set them on fire, and burned the fields. And that made the Philistines very angry. So that made uncomfortable situations for the children of Israel. But remember now, God sent Samson as their deliverance. So in their attitude of not wanting to deal with the Philistines, and because they were afraid of the Philistines, they literally called Samson and said, "We want to tie you up." They came to him and they asked permission to tie him up. Imagine that, they are tying up their deliverance. Now, this is Samson, who has proven that he has the victory over the Philistines by constantly aggravating them, doing things that prove that he had power of unnatural, supernatural power over their human strength. The Israelites were no match for the Philistines, but in under the leadership of Samson, they were victorious because he was stronger than all of them, than many mighty men, and could kill 1,000 at a time. And so they were afraid because the Philistines were angry, and they asked Samson, "Can we tie you up?" Now, it's a little humorous because Samson had to allow them to do it. If he can kill 1,000 men, who are the children of Israel to come and say, "We're going to tie you up"? And beside all that, they had the audacity to go and get new rope. And so they got new rope, tied him up, and he allowed them to do it. And so then he says, "Just promise me that you won't kill me." I'm not even sure why he said that, because again, he's stronger than they are. So he is brought to the Philistines by his own people, whom he was sent to deliver. And they deliver Samson all tied up nice and neat in a bow, so to speak, to their enemies, the one God is trying to deliver them from. And they bring him to the Philistines. Well, of course, the Philistines thought this was wonderful, but I'm thinking they had to think, how stupid, how idiotic are these children of Israel that they would tie up their own deliverance and bring it to us. And so they did. And of course, Samson, when he got among the Philistines, the ropes fell off as though they were made of wax. And again, because God had endowed him with this supernatural power. And of course, he was victorious on that day over the Philistines. But I really, really, it just stuck with me. And I brought that to the modern day thinking that, wow, we are still tying up our own deliverance. God has sent various people in our lives. He has sent pastors, ministers, mentors, and all sorts of leaders who will give their life to save us, to bring deliverance to us from our situations. We have government assistance. We have all sorts of aid out there now that is brought to people. We have ways, even in prison, to be educated, and all sorts of aid has been brought to us. And yet we are not victorious. And I've come to the conclusion it is because we have tied up our own deliverance. We don't like the inconvenience that might come with our deliverance, and so we just decide we will turn our deliverance over to the enemy. Well, how can I do that? Say I have a mentor who works hard and requires some work of me, and maybe some people may say negative things because I am under subjection of the leader who is trying to help me and bring me up to par. And so I decide to go out among the enemy and say negative things about the very person that God has sent to bring my deliverance. Oh, who does he think he is? Remember in Moses' day, well, who made you a ruler over us? And imagine, out of all those years of bondage, they turned on Moses, again, the deliverer that God had brought them, the judge, and they decided, um, who made you a god over us? We will make a golden calf. and we'll turn around and worship it. And they said, this calf brought us out of Egypt. Can you imagine that? Out of all Moses went through, out of all the plagues they saw God bring on the enemy, they yet turned on God and decided that they would worship a golden calf. And of course, we know when Moses came back, he said, who's on the Lord's side, choose you this day. And many of them died that day. They had tied up, in a sense, their own deliverance. How many of us have decided that when God brought us up, we cried out, Lord, bring me a husband, Lord, give me a job, and do this. And then when the Lord brought the husband or the job, we wanted to get rid of it because of a little inconvenience that it may have caused us. We may have had to work. We may have had to compromise, be humbled, or do some things that we may not have liked. But yet this, God has allowed this job, these people, to help us through difficult times. And yet, because we didn't want to do the work, or we didn't like being talked about or something, we decided that we would turn negative toward our own deliverance. I call that tying up your own deliverance. God will send a way out. Ultimately, he sent a way out to all sinners by having his son down the cross. We remember that the very Jews he came to save turned on him, and the day when they could have released Christ, they said, give us Barabbas, a sinner. And they chose to allow Barabbas to be freed. And they said concerning Christ, crucify him. That opened the door for the Gentiles, that's us, to be able to be engrafted into the body of Christ. And now we have access to full deliverance from sin, to heaven, which is the best deliverance ever. Not only does God bless us here on earth, but he has gone to prepare a place for us that is so great that eyes have not seen, ears have not heard. We cannot imagine the wonderful things that Christ has done for us. Again, this came with a great price. He sent his son. How many of us have rejected Jesus Christ? How many of us have tied up our own deliverance and given it back to the enemy and said, I don't want to do what it takes to be delivered. I am satisfied in my slavery, in my servitude. I will continue in the cycle of sin, servitude, supplication, and salvation. Just want to encourage you, as God brings your deliverance, don't tie it up. Walk through that door of opportunity and receive all that he has for you. One more time, do not look at your neighbor and say, do not tie up your own deliverance. It has been a pleasing pleasure to be here with you today. I hope that I have said something that encourage you, admonish you, stir you up to make right choices. God bless you and have a great day.
All right, Dr. Sandra K. We're so glad to have you today, and we appreciate those motivational words to the young people and to everyone. I wanted to ask you a few questions, and then maybe if you have a minute, some of those who are with us here on Zoom may have a question to ask. I was just thinking as you were talking about tying up your deliverance and sometimes pushing away the people who are helping you. And a lot of times that will happen. Sometimes even we as adults, we have parents, sometimes we can push our parents away, but there are young people who have parents who, just like you said, with who would give their lives for you and do everything they can for you. And yet you may reject your parents. It could be a student rejecting a teacher. And these are people, I tell my students, I said, look, we're the ones that are trying to help you. We're trying to take you somewhere. When you get out in the mean world, they're trying to kill you. They're coming against you. Why push aside and push us aside when we're trying to take you someplace?
Yes.
Sometimes it's not always comfortable, but we're trying to take you someplace and you're pushing us aside and you're accepting those that are out there that would do you harm.
Yes, and we've seen that throughout history, where the very ones who come to save people, they have been tied up, so to speak. I would like to just make one illustration and then I'm going to turn it back over to you. I didn't think, but also what my thought has been process has been in our African American history. We know that when Martin Luther King came on the scene, things got worse for a lot of people because he stirred up anger among those who were holding people under injustices. And so often African Americans turned against Martin Luther King
Yes.
because of the struggle that came with the deliverance. When God allowed Israel to gain Canaan land, they didn't walk in, they had to conquer the land. And sometimes when we have to conquer the land, we decide we don't want it and instead tie up our own deliverance.
Would you like to make any final comments, Dr. Smith, or anything you'd like to say before we close out?
I just want to say that I'm so happy to see the young people online. And a lot of times when you're young, it's hard to see this, but for you all to engage in the activities that Brother Small and his staff bring to you, this is God's way of delivering you, not only from the situations that you face now, but maybe even down the road. They're providing preparation for you. They're instilling positive things in you. And one day, my prayer is that you'll be like a tree planted by the rivers of living water, not to be moved, but to bring forth fruit in due season, fruit that will not wither, but will prosper and grow. Again, I'm so proud of you for taking advantage of this opportunity that has been placed before you.